attention to this courtroom footage. Look closely at the man in white robes standing beside the bailiff. Watch his hands. Both middle fingers raised high, defiant, completely unrepentant, even as the judge reads 7 consecutive life sentences. The cameras caught something else too, something investigators would later say sent chills down their spines. Look at his face. He's smiling. Not just any smile, but the same expression witnesses describe seeing through the eye holes of his hood right before he led his victims to what he called his chapel of judgment. This is Walter Eugene Brennan, and what he did along the back roads of Idaho will haunt you long after this video ends. Because Walter didn't just kill people, he made them believe they were being saved. You know that panic you feel when your GPS stops working in the middle of nowhere? That moment when you realize you're completely lost and your phone has no signal? For most of us, it's just an inconvenience. For 7 people traveling through rural Idaho between 2017 and 2020, that moment of confusion became the last mistake they'd ever make. Highway 93 cuts through some of the most isolated stretches of Idaho backcountry you can imagine. We're talking hundreds of miles where you might not see another car for an hour. Towns with populations under 200. Cell service that drops out for 50 miles at a stretch. It's beautiful country, don't get me wrong. But it's also the kind of place where if something goes wrong, you're on your own. And that's exactly what Walter Brennan was counting on. Before we get into what Walter became, let me paint you a picture of who he was. Or at least, who everyone thought he was. 56 years old in 2017. Former youth pastor at 3 different churches across the Pacific Northwest, father of 4 kids. On paper, he looked like a pillar of the community. One of those guys who volunteers for everything, always has a Bible verse ready, shows up to every church potluck with his famous potato salad. But here's the thing about Walter that nobody wanted to see. He'd been fired from every single one of those churches, not for anything criminal, at least not yet, but for what his former congregations called increasingly disturbing behavior. Long rambling sermons about sin and punishment that went on for hours. Bible study sessions where he'd scream at teenagers about their supposed moral failings. One church elder told investigators that Walter seemed obsessed with the idea of judgment, that he saw himself as some kind of divine instrument meant to separate the righteous from the sinful. His own kids could have told you something was deeply wrong, but by 2017, all 4 of them had cut contact with their father. They'd escaped. 7 other people wouldn't be so lucky. March 2017, 22-year-old Melissa Chen was driving from Boise to Missoula for her cousin's wedding. She was a nursing student at Boise State, 1 semester away from graduation. Responsible, smart, always called her parents when she made it somewhere safely. She left Boise at 8 in the morning. Should have been in Missoula by early afternoon. She never arrived. Her parents started calling around 6 that evening. No answer. They tried her friends, her cousin, even called the highway patrol to see if there'd been any accidents. Nothing. By midnight, they'd filed a missing person report. By morning, the search was on. Here's what made Melissa's disappearance so bizarre. 3 days later, Idaho State Police found her car on a turnout along Highway 93, about 40 miles north of Challis. The car was locked. Her purse was inside, wallet intact with all her credit cards, and $200 in cash. Her phone was there too, dead battery. But here's the weird part. On the dashboard, under the windshield wiper, was a handwritten note on lined notebook paper. The note said, "Gone to the Shepherd Sanctuary for prayer and reflection. Will return when purified. God bless." Melissa's parents swore up and down their daughter would never write something like that. She wasn't particularly religious. She'd never mentioned any sanctuary. The handwriting looked rushed, shaky, not like her usual careful script. But there were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no evidence of foul play. The car wasn't damaged. What the hell happened to Melissa Chen? Police interviewed everyone at the nearby gas stations and diners. Nobody remembered seeing her. They searched the area around where her car was found. Nothing but miles of empty wilderness. They checked every church, every retreat center, every place called a sanctuary within 100 miles. Dead ends everywhere. The case went cold. Melissa's parents appeared on local news, pleading for information. They put up a reward, but as weeks turned into months with no leads, the awful reality started to sink in. Melissa was gone, and they might never know what happened to her. Then it happened again. July 2018. 41-year-old Kevin Martinez, a pharmaceutical sales rep from Salt Lake City, was making his usual route through eastern Idaho. Kevin was the kind of guy who called his wife every single day when he was on the road. They had 3 kids under 10. He never missed those calls. But on July 23rd, Kevin's phone went straight to voicemail. His wife Sarah thought maybe he was in a dead zone. It happened sometimes on his Idaho route, but when he didn't call by bedtime, she started to worry. By the next morning, she was frantic. The Idaho State Police found Kevin's rental car 2 days later. Same highway, same type of isolated turnout, this time about 60 miles south of Salmon. And on the dashboard, another note, same type of lined notebook paper, same message about the shepherd's sanctuary and purification. Now police had a pattern, 2 people, both traveling alone on the same remote highway. Both cars found abandoned with their belongings intact, both with these strange religious notes that didn't fit their personalities or lifestyles. Kevin wasn't particularly religious either. His wife said he went to Mass on Christmas and Easter to make his mother happy, but that was about it. The FBI got involved. They analyzed the notes. The handwriting was similar but not identical on both, like someone trying to disguise their writing or forcing victims to write under duress. They started reviewing traffic camera footage, but there were almost no cameras on that stretch of highway. They interviewed truck drivers, local residents, anyone who regularly traveled Highway 93. And then the bodies started turning up. September 2018. A hunter stumbled across human remains in a densely forested area about 12 miles off Highway 93. The location was so remote you couldn't see it from the road, you'd have to know it was there. Dental records confirmed it was Melissa Chen. She'd been dead for over a year. The cause of death? That's what made every investigator's blood run cold. Melissa had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style. But that wasn't the worst part. The forensic team found evidence that she'd been held somewhere for several days before her death. There were marks on her wrists and ankles consistent with being bound. And here's what really haunted them. She'd been dressed in a white robe, like some kind of ceremonial garment, before being shot. Within weeks, they found Kevin Martinez's remains less than half a mile from where they'd found Melissa. Same execution-style shooting, same white robe, same evidence of being held captive for days before death. The FBI set up a task force. They knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but this wasn't like any serial killer case they'd seen before. The religious angle, the notes, the robes, it all pointed to someone with a twisted ideology driving their murders, someone who saw themselves as carrying out some kind of divine mission. But who? And how were they choosing their victims? December 2018. The disappearances continued. 67-year-old Thomas and 65-year-old Patricia Kowalski, a retired couple from Portland, vanished while driving through Idaho on their way to visit their daughter in Montana. Their RV was found with that same damn note. Gone to the Shepherd's Sanctuary, May 2019. 34-year-old James Wright, a teacher from Seattle, disappeared on a solo camping trip. His truck was found. Same note, same highway. September 2019, 52-year-old Linda Hernandez, a real estate agent from Nevada, was last seen getting gas in Chalice. Her car turned up 3 days later. You can guess what was on the dashboard. The FBI went public with a warning. They told people to avoid traveling alone on Highway 93. They put up billboards asking for information. They offered a $50,000 reward. The media started calling him the Sanctuary Killer. Some talking heads on TV theorized it might be a cult. Others thought maybe multiple killers working together. Nobody guessed the truth was somehow even worse than they imagined. January 2020. That's when Nicole Foster came into the picture. And she's the reason this case ever got solved. Nicole was 31, a freelance graphic designer living in Spokane. She was driving to Boise for a client meeting when her car started making this awful grinding noise about 20 miles south of Salmon. It was around 3 in the afternoon. Temperature was dropping fast. We're talking January in Idaho, probably 15 degrees out. Her phone had 1 bar of service, barely enough to Google car grinding noise, definitely not enough to call for help. She pulled over at a turnout, popped the hood, and stared at the engine like that would somehow reveal the problem. She told investigators later that she was standing there, freezing, trying to decide if she should just start walking, when a pickup truck pulled up behind her. Out stepped this guy. Late 50s, silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a heavy coat and a friendly smile. He looked like somebody's grandfather. "Car trouble?" he asked. Nicole explained about the noise. The man, he introduced himself as William, took a look under the hood, shook his head, told her it looked like her transmission was failing, not something you could fix on the side of the road. "You know what?" he said. "There's a church with a community center just about 10 minutes from here. They've got a landline, warm coffee, and I bet someone there can give you a tow truck number that'll actually answer. Cell service out here is worthless." Nicole was cold, stranded, and starting to panic. This guy seemed nice enough. He had kind eyes. He told her to follow him. He'd lead the way since the turnoff was easy to miss. So she got in her car, started it up, and followed his truck down the highway. After about 15 minutes, he put on his turn signal and headed down a narrow dirt road. Nicole followed. Then he turned onto an even narrower road. Trees pressed in close on both sides. This didn't feel like the way to any church. That's when Nicole's gut started screaming at her. She couldn't explain it, but every instinct she had told her to stop following this man. She hit the brakes. William's truck stopped too. He got out, walked back to her car, knocked on her window. "Everything okay?" he called through the glass. Nicole, thinking fast, told him she heard a weird noise and wanted to check if she'd run over something. She got out of the car, then, and this move saved her life, she accidentally dropped her keys between the driver's seat and the door. She made a show of bending down to look for them, then suddenly grabbed them, jumped in, locked the doors, and threw the car into reverse. The grinding noise was worse now, but she didn't care. She backed up as fast as she could until she could turn around, then floored it back toward the highway. In her rearview mirror, she saw William standing in the road, watching her leave. Not chasing, just watching. She made it back to Highway 93, drove until her car literally wouldn't go anymore, and flagged down a semi. The truck driver called the state police. When Nicole told her story to the Idaho State Police, something clicked. A detective named Maria Santos had been working the sanctuary killer case for 2 years. She'd reviewed every detail, every witness statement, every piece of evidence. And Nicole's story, a friendly older man offering directions to a church, leading people down isolated dirt roads, it fit. It fit perfectly. They sat Nicole down with a sketch artist. The composite image they created got distributed to every law enforcement agency in Idaho, Montana, and Washington. They also sent officers to check out every dirt road turnoff within 50 miles of where Nicole had been stranded. Most led to old logging roads, abandoned homesteads, nothing suspicious, but one road, about 8 miles from where Nicole had turned around, led to something interesting. An old summer camp that had been shut down since the early 2000s. The property had been sold to an LLC back in 2015. Public records showed the LLC was registered to one Walter Eugene Brennan of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Detective Santos pulled up everything she could find on Walter Brennan: former youth pastor, multiple churches, history of erratic behavior, 4 estranged children, and get this, he drove a dark green pickup truck, just like Nicole described. They showed Nicole a photo of Walter Brennan from his driver's license. She went pale. "That's him," she said. "That's William." Now they had a suspect, but they needed evidence. They needed to connect Walter Brennan to the murders. They needed to find out what was happening at that old summer camp property. The FBI got warrants. Warrants for Walter's phone records, his financial records, his property. They started surveillance on his house in Coeur d'Alene. And here's what they discovered. Walter had been buying bulk supplies, white fabric, rope, camping supplies, all paid for in cash from different stores across 3 states. He'd also purchased lumber, nails, and construction materials. What was he building out there? Phone records showed Walter's cell phone pinging off towers near Highway 93 on the exact dates when people had gone missing. Every single one. Financial records showed he'd been collecting disability payments from a back injury, not working, no visible income, but somehow maintaining a property and buying supplies. They needed to move carefully. If they spooked him, he might run. Or worse, if he had another victim out there right now, any wrong move could get that person killed. The FBI set up a plan. They'd monitor Walter around the clock. If he made a move toward Highway 93, they'd follow. If he led them to his killing ground, they'd finally have enough to bring him in. For 3 weeks, Walter stayed home. He went to the grocery store, went to the gas station, came back home. Normal routine. The surveillance team was starting to wonder if he'd somehow figured out they were watching. Then, on February 16, 2020, Walter loaded a backpack into his truck and headed south. The FBI followed at a distance. He drove for 2 hours, then pulled off Highway 93 onto that same dirt road where Nicole had escaped from him. They had him. They had him going to the property. Now they just needed to see what was there. The FBI called in backup. State police, local sheriff's department, everyone. They formed a perimeter around the old summer camp property and waited for the tactical team to arrive. They weren't taking any chances. At 4 p.m. on February 16, 2020, the FBI hostage rescue team moved in. They found Walter's truck parked outside the main lodge, and when they breached the door, what they found inside made seasoned agents turn away in horror. Walter had converted the lodge into what he called his chapel of divine judgment. The main room had been transformed into a courtroom. There was a judge's bench at one end, built from rough-cut lumber, a witness stand, even a jury box. Though the jury seats were empty, Walter had carved wooden figures to sit in them, crude representations of people with crosses painted on their chests. Behind the judge's bench hung a massive white banner with a red cross, the same symbol that would later appear in that courtroom footage. KKK imagery mixed with Walter's own twisted religious symbolism. But that wasn't the worst part. Off the main room, agents found a series of smaller rooms, storage rooms that Walter had converted into cells. Each one had chains bolted to the walls. Each one had a small window near the ceiling, barely big enough to let in light. And in each cell, they found evidence of occupation, personal belongings from the victims, Melissa Chen's nursing textbook, Kevin Martinez's wedding ring, Thomas Kowalski's reading glasses. These people had been held here, kept in these cells. For how long? Days? Weeks? The evidence suggested Walter had kept them alive for a while, forcing them to listen to his sermons, to participate in his twisted rituals before he eventually executed them. They found Walter in one of the back rooms, sitting at a desk, writing in a journal. He looked up when the agents came in, and he smiled. That same smile Nicole had described. That same smile that would later be captured in that courtroom footage. "I've been expecting you," he said calmly. "God told me this day would come." He didn't resist. He put his hands up, let them cuff him, even chatted politely with the agents as they let him out. Asked if they'd read their Bibles that morning, told them they looked tired, that they should rest in the Lord. The guy was completely delusional, completely divorced from reality, and yet he'd been functional enough to abduct and murder 7 people over 3 years. The search of the property took days. They found the burial sites, a clearing about a quarter-mile into the woods behind the lodge. 7 graves, though they'd only found 2 bodies before. Now they excavated all of them. Melissa Chen, Kevin Martinez, the Kowalskis, Thomas and Patricia, James Wright, Linda Hernandez, and one more grave that broke everyone's heart. 17-year-old Marcus Reed, a kid from Missoula who'd been reported as a runaway back in 2017. Nobody had connected him to the sanctuary killer because he wasn't traveling on Highway 93, he was hitchhiking, trying to get to California. Walter had picked him up, seen an opportunity, and taken it. 8 victims. 8 people whose only mistake was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, needing help, and trusting a man who looked like somebody's harmless grandfather. The FBI found Walter's journals too. Hundreds of pages of rambling religious justifications for what he'd done. He genuinely believed he was doing God's work. He wrote about how he'd prayed for guidance on Highway 93, asking God to send him lost souls who needed judgment. He wrote about his trials, how he'd bring each victim before his fake courtroom, read them their charges, which were just random Bible verses about sin, and then pronounce them guilty. He'd keep them for days, forcing them to pray, to confess sins, to beg for salvation that he had no intention of granting. His journals revealed his methodology too. He'd dress in those white robes, his own twisted version of religious garments, and present himself as some kind of prophet or shepherd. He'd tell victims he was taking them to a sanctuary where they could be cleansed of sin. Some went willingly, too scared or desperate to refuse. Others, like Nicole, had enough sense to run. And here's where that courtroom footage from the pre-intro becomes even more significant. The forensic team found something that tied everything together. A camcorder on a tripod, positioned to record everything that happened at the judge's bench. Walter had been filming himself, filming his trials. The camera's memory card contained hours of footage that would later be used as evidence in court, though most of it was too disturbing to show publicly. Investigators discovered this camera footage during their initial sweep of the property, but it took weeks to go through all of it. What they found was absolutely chilling. Walter had recorded every single one of his victims' trials. He'd dress in those white robes, sit at his judge's bench, and conduct elaborate proceedings where he'd accuse his victims of various sins, read Bible verses, and ultimately pronounce them guilty. The footage showed his victims, terrified, some begging for their lives, others too traumatized to even speak. And through it all, Walter maintained that calm, serene expression, like he was doing something holy, something necessary. This evidence became crucial during the trial. The prosecution used carefully selected clips, never showing the victims' faces, always protecting their dignity, to demonstrate Walter's state of mind. He wasn't insane in the legal sense. He knew exactly what he was doing. He planned it, executed it, and documented it. The camera footage proved premeditation. It proved he understood his actions, and it proved he felt no remorse whatsoever. But here's what really made investigators sick. When they brought Walter's 4 adult children in for questioning, every single one of them broke down. They told stories about their childhood that explained exactly how Walter had gotten so good at this. His daughter, Rachel Brennan, now 34, described how their father had conducted practice trials throughout their childhood. He'd accused them of sins, anything from talking back to eating an extra cookie, then forced them to stand in their basement while he sat on a chair elevated above them, pronouncing judgment. Sometimes he'd make them dig holes in the backyard, telling them they were digging their own graves as punishment. He'd leave them in those holes for hours. His son, Michael Brennan, 31, talked about the times their father made them wear white sheets as robes of shame and locked them in the garage overnight as punishment. About the hours-long sermons where Walter would scream about sin and damnation while his children stood motionless, not allowed to move or speak. He was rehearsing, Rachel told Detective Santos. All those years, all those mock trials and punishments, he was working up to the real thing. We were just practice. The prosecution built their case. They had the bodies. They had the property with all its evidence. They had Walter's journals. They had his video recordings. They had testimony from Nicole Foster about how he'd tried to lure her to her death. They had testimony from his children about his history of psychological abuse. Walter's defense team tried to argue insanity, but the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. The camera footage alone showed Walter was functional enough to plan, to hide evidence, to avoid capture for 3 years. He knew what he was doing was illegal. He just didn't think it was wrong. The trial lasted 6 weeks in the fall of 2020. The families of his victims gave impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. Melissa Chen's mother could barely speak through her sobs. Kevin, Martinez's oldest daughter, only 12 years old, read a letter about how much she missed her dad. Thomas and Patricia Kowalski's daughter talked about how her parents had been looking forward to retirement, to traveling, to watching their grandchildren grow up. Walter sat through most of it with that same calm smile. When the jury came back with guilty verdicts on all counts, the families sobbed with relief. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for December 2020. That's when the infamous courtroom footage happened, when Judge Patricia Morrison read out 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Walter stood up in those white robes he'd insisted on wearing throughout the trial, raised both middle fingers, and said, "You're all traveling the wrong road, and every one of you knows it." Someone caught it on camera, and the footage went viral within hours. Walter Eugene Brennan is currently serving his sentences at the Idaho State Correctional Institution. He's in segregated housing because he kept trying to hold services for other inmates. According to prison officials, he still writes letters about divine judgment, still believes he was right. The families of his victims have tried to find peace. Melissa Chen's parents started a foundation providing GPS trackers to college students. Kevin Martinez's widow became an advocate for better rural cell coverage. Nicole Foster still struggles with PTSD, but knows that trusting her gut that day saved her life and brought justice for the others. The charges Walter was convicted of: 8 counts of first-degree murder, 8 counts of aggravated kidnapping, 5 counts of felony assault, and 1 count of attempted kidnapping. 8 consecutive life sentences. He'll die in prison. Rest in peace, Melissa Chen, Kevin Martinez, Thomas and Patricia Kowalski, James Wright, Linda Hernandez, and Marcus Reed.